Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to the first lecture of our 2024-25 series of lectures for the Thornby Society. I offer the apology of our president, Chris Hindu, who is away on holiday. So you've got to put up with me as Deputy Chairman or Deputy President. It's a great pleasure of mine to welcome my friend, Dr. Kevin Grady, to give our lecture this evening. Kevin is a man of many parts. He's been university lecturer. He's been a tax inspector. He's been Marvello, the wonderful magician, director of the Leeds Civic Trust, and author of books and articles on historical subjects to do with Leeds, especially public buildings. He gives the popular February lunchtime lectures, held one time in the Holy Trinity Church and then latterly in the Leeds Minster. And of course, most recently, patron of the Thornby Society. So it's my pleasure to welcome Kevin to speak to us on his subject, Leeds' first town hall, the Moot Hall, Briggate, 1600 to 1825. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you. We're having an experimental evening. We're having a burst of energy in the Thornby Society and trying to up our game in some ways. So I'm looking at all of you thinking potential volunteers for things. But two of the things that we're doing are, first of all, we're trying to use our own technology. So we've recently bought an up-to-date projector. We've already recently bought a new laptop. We're experimenting with cameras and microphones. And thanks to Alan, we're just about managing to do a combined Zoom lecture and talk in person, that is. One of the things we were very keen to do was to get as little on the screen for those people in the room other than the slide which you can see in front of you now. We've achieved that pretty well. We still have a little screen sharing stop share, but anyway, so that's one of the key things we're doing. So I came in at relative the last minute to give this lecture, in the sense that 2 days before we printed our lecture program, the person who was giving the first lecture of the series was unable to be present. So I'm doing this lecture instead. So let's move on. Oh yes, just another question, a comment. Barbara says, if you've got a glass of wine that you've brought in, please can you take the glass and put it back on the tray at the end of the lecture, and that would be very helpful. Barbara Wakefield is in charge of housekeeping and hosting. Very important role. Right, anyway, the Moot Hall. Joseph Rhodes' painting of the Moot Hall, painted around 1824, before it was demolished, is one of the most iconic images of Leeds, I think. Though it was painted in the 1820s, it really does give us a feel for what life was like in Leeds more in the middle of the 18th century, before the Industrial Revolution. I think he's put a bit of that into the painting. Now, it's an especially important image for me, because the Moot Hall was the first building that I researched when I began on my PhD thesis at the University of Leeds in 1972. So that's 52 years ago. We clock up the decades, don't we? And since then, really, I've been collecting miscellaneous bits of information about the Moot Hall and just putting them in a folder and thinking I will use those one day. And here is the day. over 50 years ago now, I read the minutes of the Leeds Corporation, the minutes of the Leeds Committee of Pious Uses, the whole of the minutes of the Borough of Leeds Quarter Sessions records for the entire Georgian period, looking for information and little snippets about the Moot Hall. I still have my notes, and Peter Meredith is very relieved to know that, of course, next year we're celebrating the tercentenary of the death of Ralph Thoresby, and the Society is producing a special volume for that. And Peter looks at me and thinks, Kevin still owes me 2 articles for that book. I'm the only person who has not yet put our articles in, and one of them is about the Moot Hall. So this is to give Peter reassurance that he really will get an article. Right, so I want to start the story, begin by looking at the first medieval courthouse which existed in Leeds and why it was needed. So a lot of this is about the communal life of the Manor of Leeds. There it is, a wonderful diagram that Stephen Burt drew up over 30 years ago for our illustrated history of Leeds, showing what we thought the layout of the Manor of Leeds was. Now, you have to imagine yourselves as medieval peasants in the 11th century. For some of you, that'll be more difficult than for others, but we'll move on from that. So there we are. We've got the village of Leeds, which was based on Kirkgate, running west from the parish church. The Domesday Book tells us that Leeds had a priest and a church. There were 2 open field systems, which you can see on this diagram, 2 sets. The one to the northwest, the open fields of Woodhouse, and then to the southeast, the open fields or the system of Nostrop. Now, these fields were divided up into ridge and furrow strips, which were distributed between the peasant farmers of the manor. There was meadowland as well as arable strips, some of the meadowland near the river. But this was all about communal farming. There was also a manorial domain, that is the lord of the manor's home farm, a major part of which lay between the manor house, which was over where Bishopgate Street is today, from the manor house to the village, approximately the area that corresponds to the shopping centre today. And then, of course, from 1207, there was the manorial borough of Leeds, Briggate. What of the inhabitants? For communal farming to work, the peasants had to cooperate and conform to customary practices. So you had intermingled strips in the open fields allocated on quite a systematic basis. The meadows, people had strips in the meadows which were allocated again on a systematic basis. They shared ploughs, they shared oxen, and of course they shared fields. And one of the key things that Maurice Beresford used to emphasize was you had to deal with neighbours who didn't keep their animals in control and wander on and eat your crops. So those things were important. Harvest times were at the same time every year. After the harvest had been cropped, animals could graze on the stubble left in the fields at agreed times, etc., etc. It was very systematic. As far as the peasants were concerned, they had statutory obligations to the lord of the manor, compulsory labour services on the manorial domain at times. They had to pay fees or fines for various events in their lives, the marriage of their children, had to pay the lord of the manor a fee on the succession of their sons to their lands. When the father died, they had to bake bread in the manorial oven, which was actually quite a significant benefit. You had to grind your corn at the manorial corn mill, a benefit, but later on it felt like an imposition. As far as the craftsmen in the manorial borough of Leeds, they too had certain obligations to the lord of the manor to which they had to conform to. Now, the whole point of this list, it reminds me of lectures from Maurice Beresford when I first arrived at university. He made it all sound like a fairy tale. I'm not quite sure I have the pros for that. But nevertheless, the point was this had to be regulated and controlled. If there were going to be disputes, where they were going to be settled, disputes between the peasant farmers, disputes between the lord of the manor and the peasants. Basically, this was done in two courts that were usually held at the same time, or one succeeding the other. The first was the court baron. That was the lord of the manor's court. It was his personal court, where the regulations of communal farming, settling disputes, the enforcement of the lord's rights and the tenant's rights, that was one court. And the second court was for the court leet, which was held before the lord of the manor and his steward. This was effectively the lowest level at which the king's justice was administered. There was jurisdiction over petty offences and civil non-farming matters. So, of course, you had to have a place where these courts were going to be held. Fortunately for us, the court rolls for the Manor of Leeds, well, unfortunately, they've not survived. So details about the manor and indeed the manorial courthouse, we have to rely on miscellaneous references that appeared in surviving surveys and accounts for the manor in the late Middle Ages and beyond. Interestingly, the first we hear of a courthouse in Leeds is in the Reeves accounts for 1357, and that refers to a hall of pleas being on Agnes Baxter's land. Interestingly, Alice Baxter, or Bakester, also had a license to operate an oven on her land. So possibly her oven and the Hall of Pleas stood side by side, or were perhaps combined in some way. We don't know where they were or what they were like. However, we have much better luck thereafter. And here we go. Yep. By 1438, a building combining both the manorial bakehouse and the manorial courthouse had been erected. We know that it stood on the north side of Kirkgate, close to Briggate, set back behind in yards behind a plot which was later occupied by the Golden Cock Inn, and where Fish Street is today. So you get the notion it was somewhere behind those buildings. Fortunately, in 1438, the building required extensive repairs, and the work and materials needed are, say, fortunately for us, described in great detail in the Manor Reeves account for that year. So detailed is the description of the building, the materials used, stone, timber, etc. All of those things. It allowed Peter Breers very kindly, for the book that Stephen Burt and I did on Kirkgate, to produce this image, which effectively reproduces what was described in prose in the Reeves accounts. And what's so fascinating, of course, here we have the manorial bakehouse on the ground floor, and set above it the Moot Hall, or courthouse. Now, lest there be any doubt about the existence of this building, 38 years later, in 1476, the Duchy of Lancaster noted in Leeds, quote, "The common bakehouse with a Moot Hall over is well and sufficiently repaired." So it wasn't myth, it was definitely like this. Now, by the tail end of the Tudor period, this courthouse was in a very unsatisfactory state. And we know this by a wonderful survival in the, what we used to think of Leeds City Archives, now the West Yorkshire Archives Service. We know this because surviving there was a petition to Queen Elizabeth's Duchy of Lancaster, this was in 1598, for permission to build a new Moot Hall to replace the existing one. This petition observed that it was much needed because the sessions of the peace for the West Riding were held in Leeds, and they took place, and this is a quote from the petition, in a room being directly over the common ovens and furnaces there, which by the smoke and heat of the same ovens and furnaces daily ascending into the said courthouse, it is very inconvenient, noisome, and great hindrance to such as are to exercise Her Majesty's just service there. Well, as a result of that petition in November 1598, the Duchy of Lancaster gave Robert Littlewood permission to erect on a piece of land in Briggate, not in Kirkgate, this was in Kirkgate, in Briggate, a convenient, quote, a convenient moot hall and 2 chamber rooms for juries and jurors to be ready for the service of Her Majesty, as well as of her sessions of the peace, and for Her Majesty's leets, the manorial courts, because she was Lord of the Manor of Leeds, and 3-week courts here, as also for the sitting upon for highways commissions in these parts. So permission was granted in that year for a new moot hall in Briggate, but for some unknown reason, maybe it was finances, it wasn't built. However, 17 years later, things take time in Leeds, as we know. 17 years later, a new moot hall was actually built in that location. This is the chest with its 3 locks in which the documents which belong to the Pious Uses Committee, the records of donations for worthy causes and charities, were stored. It's in the vestry at Leeds Minster still, and it contains some documents directly relevant to the new moot hall. We know from a document which was described by the Pious Uses Committee as, quote, a table of writings in the old church chest relating to the church, to pious uses and to several immunities granted to the inhabitants of the borough of Leeds. And on that table of writings, it said, in May 1815, quote, a certain piece of ground at the end of the shambles was surrendered to Edward Saville and others and their heirs upon trust that, quote, they shall employ the rents of the low rooms to be built to the use of the poor and the upper rooms for a sessions house. So how was it paid for? It was paid for by the new moot hall, not this one. Well, let's perhaps I can move on. Yes, there we are. Oh, yes, it was to be paid for by using charitable funds. The trustees of the charitable funds, soon to be administered by the parish Pious Uses Committee, did indeed use the rents from the shops under the moot hall to finance poor relief. The trustees of the Pious Uses Committee were the vicar and 12 worthy men, including John Harrison and Richard Sykes. And here we see an extract from that decree. We know more detail about what was going on because of jiggery-pokery. Who would have thought of it? The misuse of the town's charity money, which led to an inquiry which produced the first decree of the Committee of Pious Uses in Leeds in 1620. We have a printed copy of this in our library, and it said, and you can read it, further, the said jury do find that the courthouse lately erected in the said town of Leeds was built and made out of the money and stock belonging to the poor of the said town of Leeds, upon the agreement of and to the true intent and purpose, and that the whole yearly profits to be made and arise out of, and by reason of the same, shall be employed to the relief of the poor. However, and further, we do find the clear yearly profits raised out of the same do amount to £20 a year above all charges. That is to say, the low rooms at £15 and the upper rooms at £5. And this is the twist. We do find that that wicked man, John Metcalfe, bailiff of Leeds, hath for the space of 2 years last past taken and converted the profits of the upper room amounting to £5 to his own and only use. Well, anyway, he was caught out. So the first description of The new Moot Hall was occasioned in 1628 by a visit of the surveyors of the Corporation of London, which had recently acquired the manor of Leeds with many other manors from the king in settlement of his debts. The commissioner's description of Leeds gives a very good impression of the setting of the Moot Hall. And here we see Lower Briggate, and we'll see the Moot Hall in Upper Briggate in a moment. The commissioner's description of Leeds gives this wonderful description. Leeds, it says, is an ancient market town. It standeth pleasantly in a fruitful and enclosed vale upon the north side of the river Aire, over or beyond a stone bridge. From thence it hath a large and broad street, paved with stone. That impressed them, directly north and continually ascending. Here we see Lower Briggate with some of the older buildings still surviving just before the junction with Ball Lane. You can see the Tower of Holy Trinity Church. So you get the date of this, but you see the sort of buildings that they might have seen. So they say the houses on both sides of thereof, referring to Briggate, and the houses on both sides thereof are very thick and close compacted together, being ancient, mean, and low built. Of course, they'd come from London. They weren't impressed. And generally all of timber, though they have stone quarries frequent in the town and about it. Only some few of the richer sort of the inhabitants have their houses more large and capacious, yet all low and straightened on their backsides. They get further up the street. In the middle of the street towards the upper end, where the marketplace standeth, is built the court, or Moot House, as they term it, and from thence upwards are the shambles, with a narrow street on both sides. And note this, much annoying the whole town, yet for their conveniency and want of room, not to be avoided or to be placed elsewhere. Well, you see on here, we see the shambles, the Moot Hall A. This is the more modern version of the Moot Hall, the shambles, and then the Market Cross. Commenting on the shambles, and if we move here, we see another wonderful survival, again painted by, in this case, I think this one is John Rhodes, probably in the early 1820s, showing one side of the shambles, which stood in a block behind the Moot Hall, and this block which split Briggate into two alleys, and then the buildings in the middle. This was on the right-hand side going up Briggate of the Moot Hall and Middle Row. This remarkable early picture, yes, by John Rhodes, the son of Joseph Rhodes, pretty evidently showed it much as the surveyors had seen it 200 years earlier. Note, I always look at this, and you can see the butcher's shops on the ground floor, and then you see these rather rickety galleries on the top floor. This is a picture in the Boyne collection at the City Library. And I always think that with their galleries, they're sort of like a third-rate version of the Chester Rose, really. But there they are, wattle and daub. Despite the fact that they were rather decrepit, Thoresby nevertheless was very impressed by the volume of business that occurred in them. And in 1715, he said, these were the best furnished flesh shambles in the north of England. But of course, we had the problem. Briggate was 66 feet wide. The Moot Hall was 28 feet wide. That meant that although it was a grand street, effectively, you were left with alleys 23 feet wide on the opposite side of the shambles, and just a mere 14 feet on this side. And of course, this was, the main road taking you to London, so it was a bit of a problem. So, we think that Leeds has traffic problems these days, and they take a very long time to deal with them. The problem of the narrowness created by the Middle Row and the Moot Hall took almost 200 years to deal with. So, This is William Lodge's Prospect of Leeds in 1685. Of course, draws of prospects had to exaggerate things and make things stick out. And Lodge put in this little sort of almost vignette of the Moot Hall popping above the buildings of Briggate. Of course, it didn't really do that. I mean, it might have done slightly. But anyway, what happened in the Moot Hall in the 17th century? Leeds Corporation, created in 1626, held its courts there. The West Riding Quarter Sessions was held there. Meetings of public bodies, meetings of the Manor Court, meetings of the Highway Commissioners, meetings of the Pious Uses Committee, meetings of the Poor Law Overseers. By the early 18th century, Thoresby was very frustrated by the decaying state of the Moot Hall, and in his Ducatus, he made the following thing, said the following thing: the Guildhall here is this day called by the Saxon denomination of Moot Hall, from a convention or assembly of the inhabitants. And this is the key thing: had Lady Danby's proposal been timely embraced, who being relict of the first mayor of Leeds, Thomas Danby, when he died in 1667, offered a considerable sum towards the building of a new Guildhall upon pillars and arches, as proposed by Mr. John Thoresby, of course that's Ralph's father, we might have boasted of a stately comitium, whereas conveniency is now all that is pretended to. This word conveniency keeps coming up and up and up. This bench, however, is honoured with the presence of persons of great quality at the county sessions, for which it is very convenient, being near the centre of the West Riding, and more frequently frequented by our own magistrates. He noted, incidentally, that just in front of the Moot Hall was the pillory and the stocks, which of course were used from time to time. So now we get on to this rather more splendid building and the issue of the rebuilding of the Moot Hall. Thoresby noted in his diary, here we see, by the way, this is Thomas Taylor's, an engraving of his picture of the Moot Hall. This is a different view to some of them, because we see this wider alley down the left-hand side of the Moot Hall, so it's really quite informative. Thoresby noted in his diary on 12th of August 1710, there was a lot going on at that point in Leeds, with the corporation about concerns consulting upon the erection of a hall for white cloths. And then a memo: the foundation of the front of the new Guildhall is now laid, the engines exercised, etc. In 1715, in his addendum to Ducatus, after celebrating the erection of the first white cloth hall, he turned to the Moot Hall. He says, the Guildhall is likewise rebuilt, the front of fine wrought stone upon columns and arches, with rustic coins and tabling. The town's arms are placed in relief betwixt the ensigns of mayoralty, the two maces. The initiation and course of the project to build the Moot Hall was recorded in the minutes of the Pious Uses Committee, the Leeds Corporation, and in the Quarter Sessions records. All three had an interest in it. At the meeting of the Leeds Corporation on 5th of June 1710, it was noted there is a design to repair and alter, note that, repair and alter the Moot Hall for the conveniency of the reception of the West Riding Justices of the Peace, who have, note this, agreed to keep the Quarter Sessions for the riding here. In other words, as rather happened with Yorkshire County Cricket, when there was a threat that county cricket would be moved to a new stadium near Wakefield, it really got things going, and magnificent new stands were variously erected. And quite clearly here, it happened quite frequently, the West Riding magistrates say, you know, this place is a dump, we'll move our Quarter Sessions somewhere else, you know, if you don't do something about it. Anyway, the minutes went on. It is agreed by this court that half the charge of altering and enlarging the hall shall be paid by the treasurer out of the corporation's stock, providing that the half do not exceed £70, and that Mr. Mayor, 11 aldermen, and 5 assistants be managers and inspectors of the. It's rather a lot of people, isn't it? Effectively, you've got 17 people who are as committee to inspect what was going on, to be managers and inspectors of the repairs on the part of the corporation, and make their report at first court after the finishing of the repairs. In parallel, the Pious Uses Committee, which of course, as it happened, had several members of the corporation sitting on it, so it was a bit incestuous. It said, it is agreed on behalf of this corporation and the trustees of the poor with Mr. William Etty of York, architect, for the repair of the Moot Hall in Leeds, according to the particulars given by the said Mr. Etty, to pay the said Mr. Etty the sum of £140 for such repairs, he performing the same exactly according to the draft by him made and given in. The one moiety, just to emphasize it, the one moiety or half to be paid by the corporation and the other by the Pious Uses Committee. Well, you look at this view. I had a very nice colour version of this in my office at Leeds Civic Trust. And when I retired, Peter Breers very kindly took this image and turned it into this. So it now sits above my piano. So as I play boogie woogie, I look at the Moot Hall. So there we are. And it does show this wonderful stone front, but that it was brick at the back. The building work did not get off to a good start. 6 weeks later, the new stone frontage must have been almost complete. And Ralph Thoresby on the 27th of August, 1710, recorded, surprised by the news of one of the workmen being slain and another wounded by the fall of some stones, as taking down the scaffolds from the new erected townhouse. That doesn't sound very promising, does it? You know, take down the scaffold and stuff is falling down on top of you. But anyway, but what started as a project to rebuild and improve the front of the building ended up with the total rebuilding, perhaps precipitated by this accident. Rather like Leeds Parish Church. Hook wanted to alter it and amend it, not demolish it, and then in the end we got an entirely new parish church. Anyway, a week later, 6th of September, the Pious Uses Committee said in its minutes, it has been found expedient and necessary to take down and rebuild the remainder of the Moot Hall, not yet agreed with Mr. Etty, and then agreed that Mr. Etty and Mr. Richard Wakefield, the builder, should be paid an additional £70 for taking down and rebuilding the said part. And if well done, the satisfaction of the committee, they shall be paid £5 more, or so much as it is Mr. Cookson Senior shall think fit. £35 of the money to be paid by the corporation. Another memorandum of the Pious Uses Committee said the builder agreed to make the remainder, as aforesaid, uniform to the present new building, and that the walls shall be a brick and a half thick. And here we see on here in the pink, the walls are brick and a half thick throughout. Now, while this was going on, the Justices of the Peace and the corporation held their meetings in the grammar school. On the 11th of April 1711, the building was complete and the magistrates met in the entirely rebuilt Moot Hall for the first time. Well, what were the physical characteristics of it? Here we have from the Pious Uses property book for 1792. Not only did it describe the income they were getting, but it also provided these plans of the Moot Hall in particular. And what it shows here, we can see, yes, at that end, there is the Moot Hall itself. And then here are higgledy-piggledy buildings of Middle Row itself, some of which were actually owned by the Pious Uses Committee. So dimensions of the new Moot Hall, 26 feet wide and 82 feet and 9 inches long. On the ground floor at the front, there was a recess, rather like a porch, 8 feet deep and 26 feet wide. On the rest of the ground floor, this is on the, go back, on the west side of the street, coming up Briggate on the left. On there was a barber's shop, a breechmaker's shop, a hatter's shop, and a hosier's shop. And on the other side, there were 6 butcher's shops, and they put numbers on it, so you could identify them in the list of the. It said the upper floor of the Guildhall or courthouse was to be entered by a set of steps at the back of the building. So you didn't go at the front; you came in some steps at the back to go into the Moot Hall part of the building. It comprised a main hall on that floor and 2 rooms, one for the magistrates and one for the grand jury. So it had an impressive frontage, and of course, Queen Anne figured in the frontage. Ducatus and Ducatus, Thoresby said, in the front of the Guildhall was left a niche for a statue, which was designed as soon as the public stock was so far recruited to pay for it. And the statue was to be a royal one. So they didn't have the money, but fortunately for them, this defect, he said, is happily supplied by the noble generosity of Alderman Milner, Justice of the Peace for the West Riding, who at his proper cost hath erected a most noble, magnificent statue of Her Majesty Queen Anne, to the full proportion in the best white marble. It was set up on the 27th of May, 1713. When Mr. Carpenter of London had perfected this exquisite specimen of his art, it was viewed by many of the nobility and gentry, who generally esteemed it the best that was ever made, not excepting the most celebrated one in St. Paul's churchyard. He was always boosting Leeds. Well, over the course of the 18th century, the building periodically required repairs. As I said, they were always under the pressure from the West Riding magistrates and threatening to stop holding the county sessions there, or some major incident having upset the grand jury. So, for example, now this is the classic view, Joseph Rhodes' painting of the Moot Hall and Briggate, which is in the art gallery. Problems that each Justice of the Peace at their court sessions in 1723 complained that several butchers and other persons do whet their knives and other sharp instruments upon the stairs and likewise upon the pillars and walls of the said hall, as also upon the pillars and steps and stones of the market cross, to the great decay thereof. These wicked butchers, there were quite a lot of them, and they warned that in future reported people would be prosecuted. And then in 1726, more problems through lack of privacy. The grand jury complained that the grand jury room in the Moot Hall is too small and scarce able to hold the number of people who have occasion to meet there, and that the same is so much exposed to public view that business before the grand jury cannot be transacted with that privacy as the nature thereof required. Reading the minutes, the quarter sessions minutes for that period, it was very obvious that there'd been trouble. And it said, the same minute, and the said jurors have also resolved that Richard Benson of the Upper Hedgerow in Leeds, aforesaid innkeeper, doth keep a lewd disorderly house, affording common fame as by the said presentment under the hand of the jurors. It is ordered that the plea relating to the said Richard Benson keeping a lewd, disorderly house be subject to the reconsideration of a future day. In other words, perfectly clear what was happening. Richard Benson had brought some of his lewd drinkers and no doubt some ladies perhaps of ill fame down there, and they were either throwing stuff at the windows or on ladders peering in and shouting and that sort of thing. And basically the grand jury couldn't really decide on the case that was before them. It was incidentally decided that the room should be enlarged. Now we jump into the early 19th century. Oh yes, and just before we get there, yes, the period 1800 to 1830, Briggate had been tremendously successful as a marketplace, as we know. It was thronged with market stalls, shops, inns, merchant houses. The removal of the cloth halls, the cloth market into cloth halls in the 1750s relieved congestion, but only for a short while. And despite the expansion of trade and traffic in the street, no improvement was made to the street in that period. None of significance. The problem persisted. The Moot Hall and Middle Row were in the way. Also, of course, the Moot Hall was very small. Now, this was clearly a significant embarrassment for the worthies of Leeds. What were they comparing their Moot Hall with? Well, Wakefield, of course, had this market cross. Believe it or not, public meetings, well, meetings of committees, there was a set of stairs in the middle of the Wakefield market cross, and you went up to a room with that lantern on the top to be lit. So Wakefield couldn't really boast too much in those terms. However, if you went to Doncaster, you had this very splendid mansion house, which was opened in 1848. Sorry, no, it was opened in 1748 at a cost of £8,000. We spent about 250 quid on our Moot Hall. They spent 32 times as much on their mansion house. Indeed, the chandeliers of the mansion house cost more than the whole of the Moot Hall. Well, what about Wakefield? Well, yes, 1785. Of course, it was, in a sense, the county town where the annual major sessions were held each year. So they had a prison and a decent town hall. And then if you went to Ripon, there, Mrs. Allenson, the effective owner of Ripon, had built this beautiful town hall as a gift to the people of Ripon, which was opened in 1801. So Leeds was rather behind these places. What was it going to do? Well, the corporation, of course, had long wanted to remove the Moot Hall, but the question was, if they were going to do that, they would need a replacement town hall. And where were the butchers going to go? By this time, there were 114 butchers in Leeds Township. 53 of them were in the shambles. So what was going to happen? Well, one problem was solved in 1813 when a courthouse and prison at the bottom of Park Row was built. It really very good. After the courthouse was open, until 1813, the upper rooms of the Moot Hall continued to house the courts of justice, but thereafter it had to find a new use. And interestingly, you might have noticed on the road drawing or painting of the building, it said auction house. Clearly it became an auction room thereafter. But what about the butchers and the shambles? Fortunately, this issue was solved by a pair of butcher brothers, the Rinder brothers, who in 1822 put forward a scheme to build a new shambles known as the Bazaar and Shambles, which we see here on burgage plots on the east side of Briggate, just the side of where the existing shambles were. This, as you can see, consisted of 2 alleys with butcher shops in them, about 60 in total. And then if you went up the stairs to the upper floor of that building, you came into the bazaar, which is effectively like a fancy goods marketplace. Somebody said it's a bit like an auction house, an antique centre where you have different booths from which people sold, but in particular, millinery. Well, what of the future of the Moot Hall? In 1814, it was resolved it would be greatly to the advantage, this is the corporation, the advantage and improvement of the town, that the insulated buildings near the cross, in other words, Middle Row, should be pulled down, laid open to the street on each side, and that a committee of the corporation should be appointed to look at the practicality of it. Well, the answer was it wasn't very practical. In Bain's 1817 directory, he said, this building, the Moot Hall, with the whole pile attached to it, is intended to be pulled down. And with a view that the magistrates make purchase, with that in view, the magistrates make purchases of property in Middle Row as it occasionally became available, and noted that on the disbanding of the Leeds Gentlemen Volunteer Cavalry, the balance of this fund was appropriated towards the fund to remove the Moot Hall. Well, since the unelected Corporation of Leeds had little money, it had no powers to levy taxes on the population. It was left to the street commissioners, the Leeds Improvement Commissioners, as an independent elected body to secure an Act of Parliament. It's amazing, as it took an Act of Parliament to get rid of this problem. In 1824, it gave them powers of compulsory purchase to any of the non-public owners of the property in Middle Row to sell their property, so purchase by compulsory purchase. And it gave powers to levy a special rate known as the Middle Row rate to finance the project. In May 1824, the Improvement Commission applied to the vicar as a representative of the Pious Users Committee to buy the property belonging to the poor estate in Middle Row, and happily it was agreed. So, oh yes, there we are. Just to remind you, this building, the bizarre shambles, survived until 1898. It was rather derelict by that point, certainly, and of course it was replaced by the County Arcade and the Estates Company development. So this is the last view of the building. Look at the transformation. There we have the upper part of Briggate in 1830. On the 4th of June, 1825, the Leeds Mercury announced the demolition of Middle Row, which has for many ages disfigured one of the finest provincial streets in the kingdom, is now completed. The last building was taken down on Monday evening, when for the first time, probably since the town was built, the whole of Briggate was seen at one view. The appearance of the street is wonderful. The old cross, is wonderfully altered and improved, as it is seen to the greatest advantage from the top of Cross Parish, the area we're looking at now. It must be confessed that some of the buildings, and we can see them on the right, some of the buildings which are now prominently brought into view have a rather mean appearance, but they cannot long remain in that state. We hope that no time will be lost in clearing away the rubbish and making the pavement, and that particular care will be taken to form a broad and handsome causeway. Well, so the Moot Hall has gone. There is a short epilogue to this story. The story of the Moot Hall didn't quite end in 1825, because there were features of it which people in Leeds rather liked. We see here at the top of the street a new corn exchange, and there we have it. Another market which was clinging tightly to its site in Briggate was the corn market, which had been held at the top of Briggate from time immemorial, and the corn factors didn't want to lose the location. So in 1827, the corn market was removed from the street into this splendid corn exchange, which is, we're at the top of Briggate. The building on the right, incidentally, still stands. At one point, it was a computer shop, and I can't remember what it does at the moment, but it's still there, very recognizable. Then you get the hedgerow, and just beyond the hedgerow, at the bottom of what today we would call New Briggate, the corn exchange was built. And you may notice that it had a niche too, and Queen Anne was put in there. So they sort of retained the memory of the Cloth Hall. And of course, Queen Anne, when the corn exchange was demolished in, I think, 1868, because they'd made the mistake, because they wanted New Briggate to be widened. So the corn exchange only lasted for, little more than 30 years, really, 40 years, 40 years. Queen Anne went to the town hall. And then she wasn't in the town hall, so she ended up in the art gallery where she is today. So she's travelled somewhat. The other feature of the Corn Exchange was they took the clock from Moot Hall and put it in the new Corn Exchange. So what was going to happen to that clock when the Corn Exchange was demolished? Well, the answer was it was auctioned off, and William Turton, proprietor of the Leeds trams, a corn provender merchant, etc., cattle owner, etc., he bought it. We don't know quite where it went to. Of course, he had that house which was later known as the Hayfield Pub, I think, in Chapeltown Road, which was his home, now demolished, and whether it went there is difficult to know. Well, there is one final sting in the tail of all this. When I was a student, I used to thrill my fellow students with the things I discovered at the archives in our student house. And whether they were interested or not, I really don't know, but I had to tell them. It's so exciting. Anyway, one day they thought they caught me out, and they rolled up in our kitchen and said, "Oh, you told us the Moot Hall was knocked down in 1826 or 25. But we have this picture of it, photograph of it, still standing." I have to admit that initially I was a bit shaken by this, and I thought, what's going on here? Well, the answer to the story is that in 1926, there was the massive celebration for the tercentenary of Leeds, and to make the town look wonderful, people were somewhat embarrassed by the state of our railway station. So in order to make it look attractive to visitors, this is look view from City Square, they decided that as a temporary measure, they put a model, scale size no doubt, of the Moot Hall in front of the crummy buildings of the railway station. So there we are. It lived on again for a short while. Well, a story of the Moot Hall and Middle Row, and the many, many years it took to achieve the removal of such an obvious obstruction to the free movement of traffic and a sanitary group of buildings, brings me to reflect on the obstacles experienced into trying to make urban improvement in Leeds over certainly the 30 years while I was director of the Civic Trust, continuing in the 7 or 8 years since. Physical developments such as the regeneration of historic buildings or streets, such as those in Kirkgate, have been held up for years by property owners. While much needed improvements, for example, in our bus and train services have been resisted by commercial operators. I have to say it took me over an hour to get here from Lawnswood this evening. Well, yes, yeah, commercial operator. Our buses are going to come back into public ownership, so that's a relief, I dare say. And it has to be said, a certain element of NIMBYism has likewise obstructed progress in those sort of spheres. Clearly, there was huge frustration at the way private property interests were obstructed and delayed, delaying the removal of Middle Row. And in the heat of the debate in 1822, at a meeting at which it was finally decided it was the corporation would, if necessary, get powers of compulsory purchase to remove Middle Row and the Moot Hall, a very wise man, Mr. Cawood, made an assertion which was reported in the Leeds Mercury and has resonated with me for over 40 years. He said, "What," he asked, "would the town of Leeds have been but a poor hamlet if private interest had not sometimes given way to public good?" So there we are. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin, drawing on your wonderful expertise about the history of Leeds and about the Moot Hall. Are there any questions? You answered questions.
Yeah.
Any questions that anybody wants to ask of Kevin? Thank you.
Yeah. Do I need a microphone?
No, we'll repeat your question.
Right. So, given that in some other places, maybe also facing like massive congestion of streets in that rough period of time, had decided, oh, we're just going to build a new road for the through traffic to go onto. Was there any consideration of doing that as an alternative to knocking down the Moot Hall?
Well, the answer to that is not exactly, because obviously Briggate was an important thoroughfare, and because of the position of the river, basically you'd have to put a bridge in. Now, I think I'm right in thinking that until, I think, what was it, 1812, if you wanted to cross the river by bridge, you would need to go to Kirkgate or you needed to go to Swillington, and there was nothing in between except for the odd ferry or two. I think Wellington Bridge was the first attempt at putting a bridge in, turnpike roads. Then, of course, we get Crown Point Bridge was 1836, I think. There was Monk Bridge, that I think was about 1826. So with the turnpike roads and bridges were coming in, but of course they still it ended up converging in Leeds town centre, and you were still left with the problem. And of course, obviously, well, question is, where would you put a new road? I suppose Park Row was a new road, but that didn't take you through the town. No, they just thought they were rather stuck. And no doubt they decided these other turnpike roads would help to some degree to solve the problem. But they kept widening Leeds Bridge as more and more traffic came along.
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
Couple of questions about signs on buildings.
Yeah.
So one just here, the one picture we've got. So would these be judgments though?
Sorry?
What would these posters on the Moot Hall be? Are they judgments, do you think, of who had
Well,
such a fine?
Yeah. Okay, so the question is, what are all these posters stuck onto the Moot Hall and what have you? Well, I dare say, I don't know the answer to your question, but by the time this picture was painted, justice was being transacted at the Moot Hall. So I rather suspect it's a lot of fly posting, really, although it is possible, but it would be quite difficult to read the notices high up. I don't know, but I suspect, I mean, one of the characteristics of the 19th century, particularly when you see photographs, is the most amazing, gaudy, unattractive signs that were put above shops, up buildings and what have you. It was absolute chaos. It was something that clearly wasn't well regulated. But it's an interesting subject for a study, I think.
The other building I wanted to ask about, do you know when you're comparing all of what other towns have done and the lecturing on those slides?
Yeah.
This was Wicklow. I think it was Wakefield, and you were looking at what other towns have done. It would have been said that it combined the court office with the betting office.
Ah, yes. The question was about the uses of the other buildings in other towns around the time, and noting that in Doncaster, not only was the Mansion House, but next to it was the betting room. In that context, of course, you might find it amazing, really, that certainly in the 1820s, the directories talked about Doncaster and said that there was no town in the north of England that had more wealthy families living in its vicinity. Of course, they had the racetrack. The St. Leger is coming up in about a week's time. And basically that drew in enormous amounts of people. So Doncaster, in a certain sort of way, was almost regarded a bit like Harrogate is now. It was a place to be seen, to see and be seen. And so the betting room was used certainly at the time of the St. Leger, but no doubt with such an enthusiasm for horse racing that steady business was done there throughout the year. But it was a very elegant place. I haven't actually been in Doncaster Mansion House, to my regret, although it's very splendid inside.
Kevin, where did the public bodies meet after the Moot Hall was demolished?
Well, after the question was, where did public bodies meet after the Moot Hall was demolished? Well, I think essentially the courthouse was used for that purpose. It was very well appointed, and therefore bodies that were considered official in any way would meet there. And of course, the courthouse also had a prison underneath it. I can't remember whether the fire station was there. Probably was as well. There was certainly a fire engine there, and yes, it was. So that was really the base. And of course, I'm just thinking about it. It was extended at various times, and of course, as you will remember, when the town hall was built, the courthouse became the post office, and all the official business took place at the new town hall. Alan.
There are 2 questions on Zoom.
Okay.
Amanda asked what happened to the shambles and the butchers when they were demolished. And Clive would ask, are any of the buildings in that picture still existing?
I think, well, 2 things. So what happened to the butchers? Basically, after the shambles, not only the shambles, the new bizarre shambles that we saw, there were, I think, 7 public slaughterhouses situated in the vicinity of the shambles. I always like to think, isn't it interesting that Harvey Nichols is cited on the site of slaughterhouses? They don't publicize that too much. The thing was that the number of butchers, I mean, who knows, I might yet repeat my lecture on slaughterhouses and abattoirs and butchers. But the fact was that by the 1820s and beyond, there were also enclaves of butchers in other locations, so that Duncan Street had quite a lot of butchers in it. It was called something like, the New Shambles. The Central Market building in Duncan Street, that had a lot of butcher shops in it. I think, we were up to about, I think, something like 120, 180 butchers in Leeds town centre at that point. So they got spread about the town, really. And then, of course, when you get the import of frozen meat and all that sort of stuff in the 1890s, then there are fewer butchers, and then we're getting butcher shops in the suburbs, etc. Oh, sorry, what?
Do any of the buildings in that still survive?
Well, I think, it's an interesting. It's unlikely because what happened is on that stretch, of course, we get building of the arcades and things like that. So a couple of them may still be encased within the structure of some of these buildings, because on the right hand side, as you went up, there was a burger shop, or I can't remember which one it was called, and when the building was fitted out to be a burger bar, when they took the plaster off the side of one wall, they discovered an entire wall that was timber framed, although the timber had been bricked in various ways. So there may be a few survivals, but I think really, had we been here in 1958, the building over here, this one, with the jetty and the double gable on the top, that was the home of Richard Sykes, one of the members of the corporation, one of the wealthiest merchants in Leeds, and that survived until the 1950s, certainly as a Timpson's shoe shop. So yes, a lot changed in the 1960s. Fleet Street, effectively, Fleet Street, because the 2 sides of the Bazaar and Shambles, one was Cheapside, which was the southern one, and the northern one of the 2 alleyways was yes, Fleet Street, and effectively that's more or less approximately on the line of Queen Victoria Street, which is now, of course, roofed over as part of the Victoria Quarter.
Just one more question. If there's any... Well, thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Kevin, for such an interesting and informative lecture.
Thank you very much. Say, fingers crossed that the technology worked and for the experience. Apparently there were over, I don't know, 56 or 60 people watching on Zoom.
Yeah.
So it was quite a well-supported event, I think.
It just remains for me to mention that the next lecture in our series on October the 10th is being presented on Zoom only. Paul Sharp will talk about James Hall, Yorkshire Mechanics Institute's national policies for technical education in early Victorian England. That's on Zoom only. And then following that, there will be our lunchtime series of lectures, lunchtime lectures. They're all available on our programme. And if you're short of a programme, I'm sure we can find one for you. Yeah, thank you very much.
Can I just make one more comment? And that is to say, for those of you on Zoom, you missed the treat of the glasses of wine and other drinks that the live audience here quaffed before this lecture started. That's part of our efforts to encourage more people to come in person to the lectures. We do hope you come, because one of the things we want to do is to make our lectures very sociable events where you can rub shoulders with friends and colleagues in the society. So we hope our alcohol bill doesn't go up too much, but nevertheless, nobody was wobbling when they came into the start of the lecture. So thank you very much.